Hello there, and welcome back to Real Conflict Zone. I'm your host, and before we dive into tonight's story, I want to thank each and every one of you for being here. Whether you're listening during your morning commute, taking a break from work, or settling in for the night, I appreciate you choosing to spend your time with us. If you're new to the channel, welcome to the community. We explore stories of survival, danger, and the extraordinary things ordinary people do when pushed to their absolute limits. If you find yourself drawn into what you're about to hear, please consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell. And for those of you who've been with us from the beginning, your support means everything. Now, let's get into tonight's story, and I promise you, this one will keep you on the edge of your seat until the very last word. No sender. No return address. Only danger inside. This is the story of Marcus Chen, a delivery driver who thought he'd seen everything in his 7 years on the job, who'd carried packages to every corner of the city, who'd learned to expect the unexpected and handle it with professional detachment. But on a cold Tuesday morning in November, Marcus would receive a delivery that would change everything, a package that came with instructions he couldn't follow and a ticking sound that meant time was running out. This is the story of what happened when one man found himself holding something he didn't understand, racing against a clock he couldn't see, trying to save lives he didn't know while everyone around him assumed he was the threat. Marcus Chen was 32 years old, born and raised in Seattle, the son of immigrants who'd come to America with nothing and built a small grocery store through decades of hard work and sacrifice. Marcus had gone to college, studied business administration, graduated with decent grades and high hopes. He'd wanted to start his own company, to be an entrepreneur like his parents, to build something meaningful. But the recession had hit just as he graduated, and jobs were scarce, and student loans were heavy, and eventually Marcus had taken a job with Pacific Express Delivery just to pay the bills, telling himself it was temporary, that something better would come along. 7 years later, he was still driving the same routes, delivering the same packages, wearing the same uniform. The entrepreneurial dreams had faded, replaced by a kind of comfortable resignation. The pay was decent, the benefits were adequate, and there was something almost meditative about the work, the repetition of it, the way each day followed a predictable pattern. Wake up at 5 in the morning, arrive at the distribution center by 6, load the truck with packages sorted by route and delivery order, hit the road by 7, spend the next 10 hours moving through the city like a piece of machinery, efficient and unremarkable. Marcus was good at his job. He had one of the best on-time delivery rates in the company, rarely made mistakes with addresses or signatures, handled damaged packages with appropriate care and documentation. His customers liked him because he was polite but not chatty, efficient but not rushed, the kind of person who showed up when expected and did what he was supposed to do without drama or complications. His supervisors liked him because he never complained, never called in sick unnecessarily, never caused problems that required management attention. But beneath the professional competence, Marcus was deeply, profoundly bored. He'd spent 7 years driving the same streets, seeing the same buildings, delivering packages to the same addresses. He knew which dogs barked behind which fences, which apartment building buzzers didn't work, which businesses always had someone available to sign and which ones required multiple attempts. He could navigate the entire delivery route without GPS, knew every shortcut and traffic pattern, could predict within minutes when he'd arrive at each stop. The boredom had settled over his life like fog, making everything gray and indistinct. He'd stopped dating seriously after his last relationship ended 2 years ago, the woman telling him she couldn't be with someone who had no ambition, no drive, no plans beyond tomorrow's route. He'd stopped seeing most of his friends because they'd moved on with their careers and lives while he remained static, unchanging, stuck. He still lived in a small apartment in the same neighborhood where he'd lived since college, still drove the same car he'd bought used 8 years ago, still ate lunch at the same food trucks and coffee shops. Sometimes Marcus wondered if this was all his life would ever be, an endless repetition of the same day, the same route, the same deliveries. He'd think about his parents, about their courage in leaving everything they knew to come to a new country, about their willingness to work 18-hour days to build something meaningful. And he'd feel a deep shame at how far he'd fallen from their example, how he'd let fear and comfort trap him in a life that required nothing of him except showing up and going through the motions. On this particular Tuesday morning in November, Marcus arrived at the Pacific Express distribution center at his usual time, parking in his usual spot, walking through the familiar routine of clocking in and checking his handheld scanner for the day's manifest. The distribution center was a massive warehouse on the industrial edge of Seattle, filled with conveyor belts and sorting machines and a constant motion of packages being moved from trucks to bins to delivery vehicles. The air smelled of cardboard and diesel exhaust, and the fluorescent lights gave everything a harsh, washed-out quality. Marcus's supervisor, a woman named Janet who'd worked for Pacific Express for 20 years and had the tired eyes of someone who'd seen every possible thing that could go wrong with package delivery, was standing near his truck when he approached. This was unusual. Supervisors generally didn't pay attention to individual drivers unless there was a problem, and Marcus made it a point never to have problems. He felt a small flutter of anxiety as he approached, wondering what he'd done wrong, what complaint had been filed, what delivery had gone missing. But Janet's expression wasn't angry or disappointed. It was concerned, maybe even worried, and that was somehow worse than anger would have been. She was holding a package, a box about 18 inches square, wrapped in plain brown paper with no visible markings except a shipping label. She handed it to Marcus and told him this was a special delivery, high priority, needed to be handled with extreme care. The destination was an address downtown, an office building Marcus knew well because he delivered there regularly. Marcus took the package, noting that it was surprisingly heavy for its size, maybe 30 pounds. The shipping label had the destination address clearly printed, along with a delivery time window between 9 and 10 in the morning. But there was no return address, no sender information, nothing to indicate where the package had come from or who had sent it. This wasn't unusual for certain types of deliveries. Legal documents or medical supplies sometimes came without full sender information for privacy reasons, but something about this package felt different. Janet told him there was one more thing, and she handed him a sealed envelope marked with the same tracking number as the package. Inside the envelope were instructions, typed on plain white paper, no letterhead or signature. The instructions were brief and explicit. Deliver the package to the specified address between 9 and 10 in the morning. Do not attempt to open the package under any circumstances. Do not scan the package through any security screening equipment. Do not deviate from the specified delivery time window. Confirm delivery directly with the recipient named on a separate card, which was also in the envelope. The recipient's name was David Torres, and there was a phone number to call for confirmation. Marcus read the instructions twice, feeling that flutter of anxiety grow into something larger, something that made his hands want to shake. These instructions were strange, overly specific in ways that suggested someone was worried about what might happen if they weren't followed exactly. The warning about not opening the package, in particular, stood out. Why would anyone think a delivery driver would open a package? It was against company policy, against professional ethics, and more importantly, it was just not something you did. He asked Janet about the unusual instructions, asked if she knew anything about the sender or what was in the package. Janet shook her head, said the package had come through special handling, had been flagged as high value and requiring personal delivery confirmation. Beyond that, she didn't know anything and didn't particularly want to know. Her advice was simple: follow the instructions exactly, get the signature, move on to the next delivery. And maybe don't think too hard about what might be in the box. Marcus loaded the package into his truck, placing it carefully in a secure position where it wouldn't shift or fall during transit. The rest of his day's deliveries were already loaded, sorted by route order, approximately 120 packages ranging from small envelopes to large boxes. The special delivery package was scheduled first, which made sense given the specific time window. Marcus would drive straight downtown, make the delivery, get his signature, and then proceed with the rest of his route. He climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, pulled out of the distribution center. It was 6:45 in the morning, the sun just starting to rise over the Seattle skyline, the city beginning to wake up for another day. Traffic would fire him for creating an incident without cause. He'd become the guy who cried bomb, who panicked over nothing, who couldn't handle a simple delivery without causing chaos. 7 years of reliable service would be forgotten, and he'd be remembered only as the driver who screwed up spectacularly. And if he couldn't keep a job as a delivery driver, what could he do? Start over at 32 with no skills except the ability to drive a route and carry packages? But what if he was right? What if this package really was dangerous, really was some kind of explosive device or biological weapon or chemical hazard? What if he delivered it to David Torres and something terrible happened, people died, a building collapsed, and investigators discovered that the delivery driver had heard ticking and done nothing? He'd be responsible, complicit, guilty of negligence at best and criminal participation at worst. His life would be over in a different way, destroyed not by overreaction but by inaction, by choosing to follow instructions even when those instructions might lead to catastrophe. Marcus realized he was sweating, his hands trembling slightly as he held the package. The ticking continued, steady and mechanical, each click seeming louder now that he was aware of it. He looked down the hallway towards Suite 2312, saw office doors and conference rooms and all the normal furnishings of corporate space. Somewhere in that suite, David Torres was presumably starting his work day, expecting a package delivery, unaware that the person carrying his package was standing in the hallway having an existential crisis about what to do. Marcus made a decision. He would deliver the package as instructed, but first he would call the number provided for David Torres, would speak to the recipient directly, would try to gauge from that conversation whether this was a legitimate delivery or something more sinister. It was a compromise, a middle path between following instructions blindly and calling security prematurely. He set the package down carefully against the wall, pulled out his phone, dialed the number from the instruction sheet. The phone rang 3 times before someone answered. A man's voice, professional and neutral, identified himself as David Torres. Marcus explained he was from Pacific Express, was in the building with a scheduled delivery, wanted to confirm the delivery before bringing the package to the suite. There was a pause on the other end of the line, long enough that Marcus wondered if Torres was checking with someone else, getting instructions, deciding how to respond. Torres told him to bring the package directly to Suite 2312, to not leave it anywhere else, to deliver it to him personally and get his signature. His tone was businesslike but slightly tense, and Marcus detected an undercurrent of urgency that did nothing to calm his nerves. Marcus asked what was in the package, claiming he needed to know for delivery purposes, but Torres deflected the question, said it was confidential materials related to ongoing legal proceedings, said it was extremely important that the package be delivered immediately and without delay. Marcus ended the call without committing to anything, his unease now fully transformed into alarm. Torres's responses had been wrong, too rehearsed, too careful, like someone reading from a script. And the urgency in his voice didn't match the casual explanation about legal materials. Marcus looked down at the package again, listened to the ticking that seemed to be getting louder, or maybe he was just more aware of it now, and he realized he couldn't deliver this package. Something was wrong, something was dangerous, and whatever consequences came from refusing to complete the delivery were preferable to being responsible for whatever this package contained. He picked up the package, held it carefully, and instead of walking towards Suite 2312, he headed back to the elevator. His plan was to take the package back to his truck, drive back to the distribution center, report the situation to Janet and let management decide how to handle it. It was the safe choice, the responsible choice, the choice that put the decision in someone else's hands. He pressed the elevator call button, waited for the doors to open, stepped inside with the ticking package in his arms. The elevator descended, and Marcus felt a small measure of relief. He was taking action, removing the package from the building, doing the right thing even if it meant complications with his job. But as the elevator passed the 15th floor, Marcus heard something that made his blood run cold. The ticking had changed. Instead of the slow, steady rhythm, it was now faster, more urgent. Tick 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 tick, no pauses between the sounds, like a countdown accelerating towards 0. Marcus's professional training as a delivery driver included basic safety protocols, and one of those protocols was what to do if you suspected a package contained hazardous materials. The rule was simple: put the package down in an open area away from people, move to a safe distance, call emergency services immediately. But Marcus was in an elevator, an enclosed metal box moving through a 30-story building, and there was no open area, no safe distance, no way to separate himself from the package. The elevator doors opened on the ground floor, and Marcus practically ran out into the lobby, the package still in his arms because he didn't dare set it down anywhere there were people. The lobby was busy, morning foot traffic as employees arrived for work, people in business attire carrying coffee cups and briefcases, security guards at their posts, cleaning staff finishing overnight shifts. Marcus looked around desperately, trying to find somewhere safe to put the package, somewhere away from civilians, but the lobby was full of people and every direction he looked showed potential casualties if something went wrong. He ran toward the loading dock entrance, back the way he'd come in, moving as fast as he could while still trying to be careful with the package. The ticking was definitely louder now, definitely faster, and Marcus had the terrible certainty that whatever mechanism was inside was reaching some kind of critical point, some countdown that was running out of time. He burst through the loading dock door, emerged into the concrete service area where delivery trucks and maintenance vehicles were parked. Marcus looked around wildly, trying to assess the situation, trying to figure out where he could safely dispose of the package. The loading dock was partially sheltered, surrounded by concrete walls and the building's foundation, which meant if the package exploded here it would likely damage the building's structural supports and potentially bring down sections of the tower above. But if he carried it out into the open street, there were pedestrians, traffic, other buildings, innocent people who had nothing to do with whatever dangerous game was being played with this delivery. That's when Marcus saw it, about 50 yards away at the edge of the loading dock area. A drainage canal, one of those concrete channels that carried storm water runoff away from the building. It was deep, maybe 8 feet, with steep concrete sides and a small amount of water at the bottom. If he could get the package into that canal, the concrete walls might contain an explosion, direct the blast downward into the earth rather than outward into populated areas. Marcus ran toward the canal, his arms aching from carrying the 30-pound package, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears, the ticking growing louder and faster with every second. He reached the edge of the canal, looked down into the concrete channel, and without allowing himself time to reconsider, he threw the package as hard as he could into the center of the drainage area. The package hit the concrete bottom with a heavy thud, and Marcus turned and ran, sprinting away from the canal, putting as much distance as possible between himself and whatever was about to happen. He made it maybe 30 yards before the explosion came. The sound was enormous, a deep concussive blast that Marcus felt in his chest before he heard it with his ears. The force of the explosion knocked him off his feet, sent him sprawling forward onto the concrete loading dock surface. His ears rang, his vision blurred from the impact, and for several seconds Marcus couldn't process what had just happened, could only lie there trying to remember how to breathe, how to move, how to function. Then the ringing in his ears began to fade, replaced by the sound of alarms, car alarms triggered by the blast, building alarms sensing the explosion, and in the distance, already, the wail of emergency sirens responding to reports of an explosion downtown. Marcus pushed himself up onto his hands and knees, shook his head to clear it, looked back toward the drainage canal. The canal was damaged, the concrete walls cracked and scorched, a small crater where the package had landed. But the concrete had held, had contained most of the blast, directing the explosive force downward and away from the building and the surrounding area. There was smoke, debris, the acrid smell of explosives, but no secondary fires, no structural damage to the building, no immediate signs that anyone else had been hurt. Marcus stood up slowly, his legs unsteady, his whole body shaking from adrenaline and shock. He'd just thrown an explosive device into a drainage canal. He'd been carrying a bomb through a downtown office building. Someone had sent him, Marcus Chen, an ordinary delivery driver, into a building with instructions to deliver an explosive package to a specific person at a specific time. And he'd almost done it, had almost followed those instructions, had come within minutes of causing a catastrophe that would have killed people and destroyed lives. Security personnel were running toward the explosion site, and Marcus could see police vehicles arriving in the street beyond the loading dock. Emergency responders were converging on the scene, and Marcus knew he needed to stay right where he was, needed to cooperate with investigators, needed to explain what had happened. He pulled out his phone with trembling hands and called 911, told the dispatcher there had been an explosion in a drainage canal behind an office building on Fifth Avenue, that it had been a package bomb, that he was the delivery driver who'd been carrying it, that he was remaining at the scene. The dispatcher kept him on the line, asking questions about his location, about whether anyone was injured, about whether there were any secondary devices or additional threats. Marcus answered as best he could, but his mind was racing, trying to understand what had just happened, trying to piece together the implications of what he'd been involved in. Someone had used Pacific Express as an unwitting delivery system for a bomb. Someone had counted on a delivery driver following instructions without question, had gambled that corporate protocol and professional routine would overcome any suspicions or concerns. Within minutes, the loading dock area was swarming with emergency personnel. Police officers established a perimeter, pushed back onlookers and building occupants, secured the scene. Firefighters inspected the damaged canal and surrounding area, checking for structural damage or hazardous materials. And federal agents, Marcus could tell they were federal by their suits and their bearing and the way local police deferred to them, began interviewing witnesses and collecting evidence. A federal agent approached Marcus, identified himself as Special Agent William Morrison with the FBI, asked Marcus to walk him through exactly what had happened. Marcus explained everything, from receiving the package at the distribution center that morning, to the unusual instructions, to hearing the ticking in the elevator, to his decision not to deliver the package and instead try to safely dispose of it. Morrison listened without interrupting, taking notes, his expression giving away nothing about whether Marcus was being viewed as a witness or a suspect. When Marcus finished his account, Morrison asked to see the instruction sheet that had come with the package. Marcus pulled it from his pocket, handed it over, watched as the agent read through the typed instructions with careful attention. Morrison asked about the phone call Marcus had made to David Torres, asked what Torres had said, asked if Marcus had recorded the conversation. Marcus said he hadn't recorded it, explained Torres's responses, described the tension and urgency he detected in the man's voice. Morrison made more notes, then asked Marcus to remain at the scene, said other agents would need to interview him, that the package and its contents would need to be analyzed, that this was now a federal investigation into attempted domestic terrorism or possibly attempted murder. Marcus nodded, understanding that his day had gone from routine delivery driver work to being involved in a major federal case. He called Janet at the distribution center, explained in brief terms that there had been an incident, that he wouldn't be completing his route today, that she should probably expect visits from federal investigators. Over the next several hours, Marcus was interviewed by multiple agents, each one asking variations of the same questions, probing for details, checking for inconsistencies in his story. He described the package again and again, the weight of it, the sound of the ticking, the acceleration of that sound as he descended in the elevator. He described his decision-making process, his reasoning for not delivering the package as instructed, his choice to dispose of it in the drainage canal rather than simply abandoning it somewhere in the building. The agent seemed particularly interested in the instruction sheet, in the specific warnings about not opening the package and the requirement to deliver it at a specific time. One agent asked Marcus if he understood why the timing might have been important, and Marcus admitted he hadn't thought about it at the time, had been too focused on the immediate danger. The agent explained that package bombs could be designed with various trigger mechanisms, timers that activated at specific moments, pressure sensors that detected when a package was opened, even radio triggers that could be activated remotely. The specific delivery time window might have been designed to ensure the bomb reached its target while the building was fully occupied, maximizing potential casualties. Marcus felt sick as he considered this, as he thought about what might have happened if he delivered the package as instructed. David Torres would have received it, might have opened it immediately or been in the vicinity when the timer reached 0. The explosion would have occurred on the 23rd floor, in a densely occupied office environment, with nowhere for people to escape and structural damage that could have compromised the entire building. Dozens of people could have died, maybe hundreds depending on the size and placement of the explosive device. But who was David Torres, and why would someone want to kill him with a package bomb delivered to his office? The FBI agents wouldn't tell Marcus anything about their investigation into that question, but Marcus could see the activity, could watch as federal agents and police officers entered the building in force, clearly moving to secure David Torres and investigate whatever was happening on the 23rd floor. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus was finally released from the scene, told he could go home but should expect additional follow-up interviews in the coming days. He was also told, in no uncertain terms, that he should not speak to media about what had happened, should not post anything on social media, should not discuss the case with anyone except his lawyer if he chose to retain one. The investigation was ongoing, sensitive, and required confidentiality to protect both the integrity of the investigation and potentially other lives if there were additional threats. Marcus drove back to the distribution center in his delivery truck, the back still loaded with all the other packages he'd been supposed to deliver that day. He felt numb, disconnected, like he was watching himself from a distance. Janet met him in the parking lot, her expression a mixture of concern and frustration, and told him to go home, take the rest of the day off, probably take tomorrow off too. The company would handle the customer service issues related to his undelivered packages, would deal with whatever fallout came from having one of their drivers involved in a bombing incident. Marcus drove to his apartment, parked in his usual spot, climbed the stairs to his unit. Everything looked exactly as he'd left it that morning, the breakfast dishes still in the sink, his work jacket hung on the back of a chair, his life frozen in the moment before everything changed. But Marcus had changed. He couldn't quite articulate how, couldn't fully process what had happened, but something fundamental had shifted in the way he understood himself and his place in the world. He turned on the television, found a news channel, and there it was, breaking news about an explosion downtown, about a potential terrorist attack that had been thwarted by a delivery driver who'd recognized suspicious package and prevented its delivery. The news didn't have Marcus's name yet, the FBI had kept that detail confidential for now, but the story was already being framed as a heroic act, a tragedy averted, a reminder to stay vigilant in these dangerous times. Marcus watched the coverage with a strange sense of detachment. They were talking about him, about what he'd done, but the way they described it bore little resemblance to what he'd actually experienced. They made it sound like he'd immediately recognized the danger, had acted with confidence and clarity, had been brave and decisive. But Marcus remembered the fear, the uncertainty, the awful weight of not knowing whether he was overreacting or underreacting, whether his next decision would save lives or cost them. His phone started ringing. Friends and family who'd seen the news and were putting together that he worked for Pacific Express and might have been the delivery driver involved in the incident. Marcus didn't answer, couldn't face the questions and the congratulations and the inevitable request to explain what had happened. He sat in his apartment as darkness fell outside, thinking about the package, about David Torres, about the ticking sound that had warned him something was terribly wrong. The next morning, Marcus woke to find his apartment building surrounded by news vans. Someone had leaked his name to the media, and now reporters wanted interviews, wanted his story, wanted to paint him as either a hero who'd saved lives or an ordinary person caught in extraordinary circumstances. Marcus called Janet, asked what he should do, and Janet told him the company had hired a crisis management firm to handle media relations, that someone would be contacting him to coordinate any public statements. But before the crisis management people could reach him, Marcus received another call, this one from Special Agent Morrison at the FBI. Morrison asked if Marcus could come to the FBI field office for an interview, said there had been developments in the investigation, said it was important they speak as soon as possible. Marcus agreed, grateful for an excuse to leave his apartment and the media circus surrounding it. At the FBI field office, Morrison led Marcus to a conference room and distribution center security footage showed no indication of suspicious activity, no evidence that anyone there had been aware of what the package really contained. The criminals had relied on the assumption that delivery company employees would follow standard procedures without question, that routine and protocol would overcome any individual suspicions. David Torres, the intended target, was placed in protective custody while the trial proceeded. His prosecution of the criminal organization continued despite the assassination attempt, though with significantly enhanced security measures and remote testimony for some witnesses who feared retaliation. The trial resulted in convictions for multiple defendants, including the people who'd planned the bombing attempt. Torres survived to prosecute other cases, though Marcus read in follow-up news articles that Torres eventually left the prosecutor's office and took a teaching position at a law school, the stress and danger of his work having finally exceeded his willingness to continue. For Marcus, the aftermath of the incident stretched across months of interviews, depositions, and media attention he never wanted and didn't know how to handle. The crisis management firm hired by Pacific Express coached him on how to speak to reporters, what to say and what not to say, how to present himself as both heroic and humble, extraordinary and ordinary at the same time. Marcus did a few carefully controlled interviews, appeared on a couple of news programs, told his story the way the publicists wanted it told. But the real story, the story Marcus couldn't fully articulate even to himself, was about the weight of responsibility, about the terrible burden of making decisions when you don't have enough information and the consequences could be catastrophic either way. Marcus had gotten lucky, had heard the ticking sound that warned him of danger, had trusted his instincts enough to act on that warning. But what if the bomb had been silent? What if the timer mechanism hadn't made any sound? What if Marcus had been having a particularly stressful morning and had been too distracted to notice something was wrong? He would have delivered the package. He would have handed it to David Torres or left it at the reception desk in Suite 2312. He would have gotten his signature, moved on to his next delivery, and 15 minutes later, while he was driving to another address, the bomb would have detonated. People would have died, and Marcus would have been the person who delivered the weapon that killed them. The fact that he wouldn't have known, wouldn't have been criminally responsible, wouldn't have intended any harm, none of that would have changed the reality that his actions would have resulted in deaths. This realization haunted Marcus in ways he couldn't explain to the reporters or the FBI agents or even his own family. Everyone wanted to celebrate him as a hero, wanted to focus on the lives he'd saved by recognizing the danger and preventing the delivery. But Marcus kept thinking about all the things that could have gone differently, all the ways he could have made the wrong choice, all the moments where luck and instinct had been the only thing standing between him and catastrophe. Pacific Express offered him a promotion, a position in corporate security where he'd help develop better protocols for handling suspicious packages. The salary was better, the work would be more interesting, and it would get him off the delivery routes he'd been driving for 7 years. Marcus accepted, partly because it seemed like the logical next step, partly because he couldn't imagine going back to his old routine after everything that had happened. But he also accepted because he felt a responsibility to use what he'd learned, to help prevent other delivery drivers from being put in the same impossible position he'd faced. In his new role, Marcus worked with law enforcement and security consultants to create training programs for delivery personnel. He helped design better procedures for verifying senders and inspecting suspicious packages. He became an expert in recognizing the signs that a delivery might be dangerous, the patterns that suggested something was wrong. And he told his story, over and over, to rooms full of delivery drivers and postal workers and freight handlers, trying to impress upon them the importance of trusting their instincts, of being willing to stop and question rather than simply following instructions blindly. But even as Marcus built this new career, even as he became known as the delivery driver who'd stopped a bombing and gone on to help prevent future attacks, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been changed by the experience in ways he didn't fully understand. The comfortable resignation that had defined his life before that Tuesday morning was gone, replaced by a heightened awareness of risk and consequence that made it hard to relax, hard to trust that routine was safe, hard to assume that tomorrow would be like today. He started seeing a therapist, someone who specialized in trauma and post-traumatic stress. The therapist explained that what Marcus was experiencing was a normal response to having faced a life-threatening situation, that his hypervigilance and anxiety were his mind's way of trying to protect him from future danger. They worked on techniques for managing the anxiety, for learning to distinguish between reasonable caution and paralyzing fear, for finding a balance between awareness and obsession. Slowly, over months, Marcus began to rebuild his life. He started dating again, met a woman named Sarah who worked as an emergency room nurse and understood something about dealing with crisis and stress. He reconnected with old friends, found that while they were curious about what had happened, they were more interested in who he was now than in rehashing the details of that morning. He moved to a new apartment, one that wasn't surrounded by reporters, one where he could start fresh without constant reminders of the incident. But the package, and what it represented, never entirely left his thoughts. Marcus would be driving to work or grocery shopping or watching television, and suddenly he'd remember the weight of it in his arms, the sound of the ticking, the moment when he realized he was carrying something that could kill him and everyone around him. He'd remember the split-second decisions, the uncertainty, the fear that he was making the wrong choice and people would die because of it. 2 years after the incident, Marcus was invited to speak at a conference on domestic terrorism prevention. The conference brought together law enforcement officials, security professionals, delivery company executives, and policymakers, all trying to address the growing threat of package bombs and other attacks that exploited commercial delivery systems. Marcus stood at a podium in front of several hundred people and told his story one more time, describing the package, the instructions, the ticking, and his decision to throw it into the drainage canal rather than deliver it or simply abandon it. After his presentation, during the question and answer session, someone in the audience asked Marcus what he thought had been the most important factor in his decision to act, what advice he'd give to other delivery personnel who might face similar situations. Marcus thought about this question for a long moment, aware that everyone in the room was looking to him for wisdom, for some clear guidance that would help them prepare for threats they hoped never to encounter. He told them that there wasn't any single factor, no magic formula that would tell you when something was wrong. He said that in his case, it had been a combination of small things, the unusual instructions, the missing sender information, Janet's concerned expression, the ticking sound, the tension in David Torres's voice on the phone. None of those things alone would have been conclusive, but together they'd created a pattern that his instincts recognized as dangerous. But more than that, Marcus said, what had mattered was his willingness to trust those instincts even when it would have been easier to ignore them. He'd spent 7 years delivering packages without incident, 7 years where following the routine had been safe and efficient and exactly what he was supposed to do. Breaking that routine, choosing to stop and question, deciding to act on a suspicion rather than a certainty, those choices had gone against everything his training and experience had taught him. And yet those choices had been the right ones. Marcus told the audience that he couldn't give them a checklist or a procedure that would guarantee safety. What he could tell them was that being willing to be wrong, being willing to cause disruption and inconvenience based on nothing more than a feeling that something wasn't right, that willingness was sometimes the only thing standing between routine and catastrophe. And that everyone who worked in delivery or logistics or any system that could be exploited by people with violent intentions, everyone in those roles needed to understand that they had permission to stop, to question, to refuse, even if it meant being wrong and looking foolish. The response to his presentation was overwhelming. People thanked him for his honesty, for not pretending that his decision had been easy or obvious, for acknowledging the fear and uncertainty that had accompanied his actions. Several delivery company executives told him they were revising their protocols based on his experience, creating clearer guidelines that explicitly permitted and encouraged employees to report suspicious packages without fear of punishment for being overly cautious. In the months following the conference, Marcus began to receive letters and emails from delivery drivers and postal workers across the country, people who'd heard his story and wanted to share their own experiences. Some had encountered suspicious packages and had reported them successfully. Others had ignored warning signs because they were afraid of overreacting, and while nothing bad had happened in those cases, they now realized how lucky they'd been. A few told him about packages they delivered that later turned out to be dangerous, and the guilt they carried for having been the person who delivered a weapon or contraband without knowing it. Marcus tried to respond to as many of these messages as he could, offering encouragement and understanding, sharing what he'd learned about managing the psychological aftermath of these experiences. He'd discovered that there was a community of people who'd been involved in similar incidents, people who understood the specific burden of having been used as an unwitting tool by people with violent intentions. They formed informal support networks, shared coping strategies, and helped each other process the complicated emotions that came with these experiences. 3 years after the incident, the criminal organization that had sent the package bomb was largely dismantled, its leadership convicted and imprisoned, its operations disrupted by ongoing law enforcement pressure. David Torres was still alive, still teaching law, and Marcus had met with him once, a private conversation arranged through the FBI. They'd talked about what had happened, about the choices Marcus had made, about the strange connection between them created by that package and that morning. Torres had thanked Marcus for saving his life, but Marcus had found himself unable to simply accept that gratitude. He'd explained to Torres that he hadn't saved anyone's life in any heroic sense, that he'd simply been afraid and uncertain and had made what seemed like the least terrible choice available to him. Torres had listened and then said something that Marcus found himself thinking about long after their meeting ended. Torres told him that heroism wasn't about fearlessness or certainty or dramatic action. It was about doing the right thing despite fear, despite uncertainty, despite not knowing whether you were making the correct choice. Marcus had been terrified, had doubted himself, had been aware that his decision might be wrong. But he'd acted anyway, had trusted himself enough to break the routine and do what his instincts told him was necessary. And that, Torres said, was exactly what heroism looked like in the real world, messy and uncertain and profoundly human. Marcus didn't know if he agreed with that assessment. He still had trouble thinking of himself as heroic, still felt more like someone who'd gotten lucky than someone who'd done something extraordinary. But he'd come to accept that his experience had changed him in permanent ways, that he couldn't go back to being the person he'd been before that Tuesday morning, comfortable in his routine and resigned to a life of predictable monotony. The boredom that had defined his existence before the incident never returned. Marcus found that he couldn't tolerate the kind of automatic behavior that had once seemed so safe and reliable. He questioned things, looked for patterns, paid attention to details that others missed. It made him good at his job in corporate security, made him valuable to Pacific Express and to the law enforcement agencies he consulted with. But it also made it hard to relax, hard to let his guard down, hard to trust that ordinary moments were truly ordinary. Sarah, the woman he'd been dating, eventually became his wife. She understood his vigilance because she'd developed her own version of it working in emergency medicine, seeing how quickly normal situations could turn catastrophic. They built a life together that acknowledged the uncertainty of the world without being paralyzed by it, that prepared for worst-case scenarios without expecting them around every corner. They learned to find moments of peace and joy despite knowing how fragile those moments could be. Marcus's parents were proud of him in ways they'd never been when he was just a delivery driver following a predictable route. They told friends and relatives about their son who'd stopped a terrorist attack, who'd saved lives, who'd become an expert in security and prevention. Marcus appreciated their pride but sometimes missed the simpler relationship they'd had before, when his life was unremarkable and they worried about ordinary things like his career prospects and whether he'd ever settle down. On the 4th anniversary of the incident, Marcus drove out to the office building where it had all happened. The drainage canal where he'd thrown the package had been repaired and reinforced, the concrete replaced, the whole area looking normal and unremarkable. There was no plaque or memorial, no indication that anything significant had occurred there. Most of the people who worked in the building probably didn't know the story, or if they did, it was just another piece of office building lore, something that had happened years ago to people they'd never met. Marcus stood at the edge of the repaired canal and thought about that morning, about the decisions he'd made and the luck that had allowed those decisions to be the right ones. He thought about all the ways it could have gone differently, all the alternate versions of that day where he'd made different choices and people had died. And he thought about what David Torres had said about heroism, about doing the right thing despite fear and uncertainty. Maybe Torres had been right. Maybe heroism wasn't about being fearless or certain, wasn't about dramatic action or clear moral choices. Maybe it was just about being willing to trust yourself when you had to make decisions without enough information, about being willing to act even when you might be wrong, about caring enough about other people to accept the burden of responsibility for choices that could affect their lives. Marcus had carried a package that morning, just like he'd carried thousands of packages before and thousands since. But that one package had contained not just an explosive device but a test, a moral challenge that he hadn't known he'd face until he was in the middle of it. And somehow, through a combination of instinct and luck and willingness to break routine, he'd passed that test. He'd recognized danger, he'd made a choice, and he'd accepted the consequences of that choice. The ticking sound that had warned him still echoed in his memory sometimes, that slow rhythmic clicking that had accelerated into urgency as the timer counted down toward detonation. It was a sound that represented everything about that experience, the warning that something was wrong, the pressure of time running out, the acceleration toward a moment of truth where choices would be made and consequences would follow. Marcus returned to his car and drove back toward his home, back toward his life, back toward the work he did now that tried to prevent other people from having to face what he'd faced. He'd never be able to completely escape that morning, would never be able to forget the weight of the package in his arms or the sound of the ticking or the moment when he'd thrown it into the canal and run. But he'd learned to live with those memories, to integrate them into who he was now rather than being defined by them. The package had arrived with no sender, no return address, only danger inside. But it had also arrived with an instruction, a warning that should have been suspicious, a clue that something was wrong. Marcus had been meant to ignore that warning, to follow his routine, to deliver the package without question. Instead, he'd questioned. He'd stopped. He'd acted. And because of that, people were alive who might have died, including himself. Years later, when Marcus was training new security personnel or speaking at conferences or consulting with law enforcement agencies, he would tell them about the package. But he wouldn't frame it as a story about heroism or bravery. He'd frame it as a story about attention, about listening to the small voice that says something isn't right, about being willing to look foolish or cause inconvenience rather than ignore a warning. Because in the end, that's what had saved lives that morning. Not courage or skill or dramatic action, but simple attention, a willingness to notice the ticking, to acknowledge the unease, to trust that his instincts were telling him something important. The package had been designed to exploit routine and trust, to turn normal delivery procedures into a weapon. Marcus had survived because he'd been willing to break that routine, to question that trust, to recognize that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is exactly what you're supposed to do. The lesson wasn't just for delivery drivers or security personnel. It was for everyone who'd ever been asked to follow instructions without question, who'd ever felt something was wrong but suppressed that feeling because speaking up would be inconvenient or embarrassing. Marcus had learned, in the hardest way possible, that intuition matters, that the cost of being wrong about danger is usually less than the cost of ignoring danger until it's too late. He'd checked into work that morning expecting another ordinary day, another routine route, another series of predictable deliveries. Instead, he'd been handed a package that changed his life, that forced him to make choices he wasn't prepared for, that tested whether he would follow instructions or trust himself. And in that test, in that moment of decision, Marcus had discovered something about himself that he hadn't known before. He was capable of more than routine. He was capable of recognizing danger, of making hard choices, of acting decisively when action was required. He'd spent 7 years believing he was just an ordinary person doing ordinary work, comfortable in his resignation to a predictable life. But when the moment came, when he had to choose between safe routine and uncertain action, he'd found the strength to act. The package had contained danger, yes. But it had also contained possibility, the possibility of discovering who he really was, what he was capable of, how he would respond when everything depended on his choices. And Marcus had discovered that he was someone who would choose to act, who would trust his instincts, who would accept responsibility for decisions that could save lives or cost them. It wasn't the kind of discovery anyone would choose to make. Marcus would have preferred to never face that situation, to continue his comfortable routine, to remain ignorant of the dangers that existed in the world and the ways those dangers could find even ordinary people doing ordinary work. But having faced it, having made his choices and lived with their consequences, Marcus had become someone different, someone more aware, more capable, more alive to the possibilities and responsibilities that came with each decision. The ticking had been a warning, but it had also been an awakening. And Marcus Chen, who'd once been just a delivery driver following a predictable route, had become someone who understood that the most important deliveries weren't the ones you completed, but the ones you refused, the ones where you recognized danger and chose to act despite fear, despite uncertainty, despite the possibility of being wrong. That was the real story of the package, the story that couldn't be captured in news reports or press conferences or training presentations. It was a story about a man who'd been given a choice he didn't want, who'd made a decision without certainty, who'd survived because he'd been willing to trust himself when trust was the only option available. And in surviving, in making that choice, Marcus had discovered that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things when circumstances demand it. The package had arrived with instructions to never open it. Marcus had followed that instruction but broken all the others, and in breaking those instructions, he'd saved lives, including his own. It was a lesson written in explosives and fear and the seconds ticking away toward catastrophe. A lesson about the value of attention, the importance of instinct, and the courage required to act when action goes against everything you're trained to do. And somewhere in Seattle, in an office building where people worked and lived their ordinary lives, there was a drainage canal that had once contained an explosion, that had once been the site where an ordinary delivery driver made an extraordinary choice. The canal was repaired now, anonymous and unremarkable, just another piece of urban infrastructure. But Marcus would always remember it as the place where he'd thrown away a package and discovered who he really was. No sender. No return address. Only danger inside. But also opportunity, possibility, the chance to prove that even in a world of routine and resignation, individuals still matter, choices still have meaning, and ordinary people can rise to extraordinary moments when those moments arrive. Marcus had been that ordinary person, and he'd risen to that extraordinary moment, and he'd carry the memory of it for the rest of his life. 5 years after the incident, Marcus received an unexpected phone call from Special Agent Morrison, the FBI agent who'd first interviewed him at the scene. Morrison's voice carried a weight that Marcus immediately recognized, the tone of someone about to ask for something difficult. They arranged to meet at a coffee shop in downtown Seattle, neutral territory where they could talk without the formality of an FBI office or the intimacy of Marcus's home. Morrison looked older than Marcus remembered, gray threading through his hair, lines around his eyes deeper than they'd been. The job took its toll, Marcus understood that now in ways he hadn't before. They ordered coffee and found a quiet corner booth away from other customers. Morrison didn't waste time on pleasantries. There had been another incident, he explained, this one in Portland. Another package bomb, another delivery driver, but this time the outcome had been different. The driver hadn't noticed anything wrong until it was too late. He'd delivered the package to an accounting firm, gotten his signature, moved on to his next stop. 20 minutes later, the bomb had detonated, killing 3 people including the intended target, a forensic accountant who'd been preparing to testify in a financial fraud case. The delivery driver was physically unharmed but psychologically devastated, racked with guilt even though investigators had found no warning signs he could reasonably have been expected to notice. Morrison wanted Marcus to talk to this driver, to help him understand that what had happened wasn't his fault, that some bombs were designed specifically to avoid detection, that even trained professionals might not have caught the signs. Marcus felt his stomach tighten at the request. He'd spent 5 years trying to move past his own experience, building a life that acknowledged what had happened without being consumed by it. The idea of reopening those wounds, of confronting another person's trauma while still managing his own, felt overwhelming. But he agreed, because Morrison was right that Marcus might be the only person who could truly understand what this other driver was experiencing. The guilt of having been the delivery mechanism for violence, even unknowing violence, created a particular kind of psychological burden that was hard to explain to people who hadn't lived through it. Marcus knew that burden intimately, carried it still despite all the therapy and time and rational understanding that he'd done nothing wrong. The Portland driver's name was James Sullivan, a 53-year-old man who'd been delivering packages for 22 years without incident. Marcus met him at a diner near Sullivan's home, recognized immediately the shell-shocked expression, the way Sullivan's hands trembled slightly as he held his coffee cup, the exhaustion that came from not sleeping properly for weeks. They were strangers, but they shared an experience that created instant, unwanted kinship. Sullivan told Marcus everything, his voice flat and mechanical, the words rehearsed from having repeated them to investigators and therapists, and his own tormented thoughts in the middle of sleepless nights. The package had seemed completely normal, professionally wrapped, proper documentation, nothing suspicious about the weight or appearance. The recipient had been expecting a delivery, had signed for it with a smile, had thanked Sullivan for his prompt service. And then Sullivan had driven away, completing his route, delivering dozens more packages, eating lunch at his usual spot, everything absolutely routine. He'd been on his way back to the distribution center when the call came, his supervisor telling him to pull over, telling him to wait for police to arrive, telling him there had been an explosion at one of his delivery addresses. Sullivan had driven there on autopilot, had been questioned by investigators, had learned that his signature log showed he'd been the one to deliver the package that had killed 3 people. The forensic accountant. The accountant's assistant. A colleague who'd been in the wrong office at the wrong time. Sullivan kept saying he should have known, should have noticed something, should have refused to deliver it. Marcus listened to this litany of self-blame and recognized every word, had spoken similar words himself in those first months after his own incident. He let Sullivan talk, let him pour out all the guilt and anguish and desperate need to have made different choices that weren't actually available to him at the time. When Sullivan finally ran out of words, Marcus told him the truth that no one else could tell him with the same authority. It wasn't his fault. The bomb had been designed by professionals who understood delivery procedures, who knew how to create a package that would pass through security screening and visual inspection without raising alarms. Sullivan had followed proper protocols, had done exactly what he was trained to do, had made all the reasonable choices available to him with the information he had. But Sullivan shook his head, said Marcus didn't understand. Marcus had heard the ticking and recognized the danger and acted heroically. Sullivan had noticed nothing, had delivered death without even realizing it, had smiled and exchanged pleasantries while carrying a weapon that would kill 3 innocent people. How could those 2 situations be comparable? How could Marcus claim to understand when Marcus was a hero and Sullivan was the person who delivered the murder weapon? Marcus felt anger flash through him at this characterization, anger not at Sullivan but at the narrative that had grown around his own experience. He told Sullivan that he hadn't been heroic, that he'd been terrified and uncertain and had gotten incredibly lucky that the bomb in his case had been fitted with an audible timer. If his bomb had been silent like Sullivan's, Marcus would have delivered it too, would have handed it to David Torres with a smile and a signature request, would have been just as responsible for the resulting deaths. The only difference between them, Marcus insisted, was that his bomb had given him warning and Sullivan's hadn't. That wasn't heroism on Marcus's part or failure on Sullivan's. It was just chance, just the random variation in how different criminals built their weapons, just luck that had nothing to do with either man's choices or capabilities or moral worth. Sullivan had been handed an impossible situation where all the reasonable choices led to the same tragic outcome, and he couldn't torture himself for not making a choice that hadn't actually existed. They talked for 3 hours, coffee growing cold and being replaced, the diner filling and emptying with lunch rush and then afternoon quiet. Marcus shared details of his own experience that he'd never told reporters or conference audiences, the moments of crushing doubt, the nightmares he still had sometimes about alternative timelines where he made different choices, the guilt he felt even though rationally he knew he'd done the right thing. He told Sullivan about the therapy, about learning to separate rational responsibility from emotional guilt, about finding ways to live with memories that would never completely fade. Sullivan listened with an intensity that bordered on desperate, like Marcus's words were a lifeline he was clinging to. When they finally parted, Sullivan thanked Marcus with genuine emotion, said it had helped to talk to someone who truly understood, who didn't just offer hollow reassurances or demand that Sullivan forgive himself before he was ready. Marcus gave Sullivan his contact information, told him to call any time, day or night, if he needed to talk to someone who'd been through something similar. Driving back to Seattle, Marcus thought about the conversation, about Sullivan's pain and his own lingering wounds. The incident 5 years ago had changed him permanently, had given him knowledge and perspective he would never have chosen to acquire. But maybe that knowledge had value beyond his own life, maybe his experience could help others who found themselves in similar situations, carrying guilt for things that weren't their fault, struggling to forgive themselves for choices that had seemed reasonable at the time. This realization led Marcus to start something new. He reached out to other delivery drivers and postal workers who'd been involved in similar incidents, people who'd unknowingly carried bombs or contraband or weapons, who'd been used as tools by people with violent intentions. With help from the FBI and various delivery companies, Marcus organized a support group, a confidential space where these workers could share their experiences without judgment, could process their trauma with people who truly understood the specific burden they carried. The first meeting was held in a community center conference room in Seattle, with just 8 people attending, all of them carrying similar stories of having delivered danger without knowing it, all struggling with guilt and fear and the psychological aftermath of their experiences. Marcus facilitated the discussion, sharing his own story not as an example of heroism but as illustration of how random chance could determine outcomes, how the same basic situation could resolve in different ways based on factors completely outside anyone's control. The support group grew over time, expanding to multiple cities, developing online forums for people who couldn't attend in-person meetings, creating resources for families and employers trying to understand what these workers were experiencing. Marcus found himself becoming an advocate for delivery personnel, pushing companies to provide better mental health support, arguing for policy changes that would acknowledge the psychological risks that came with the job, working to destigmatize the trauma these workers experienced. This advocacy work brought Marcus into contact with policymakers and corporate executives who were grappling with the growing threat of package-based attacks. In the years following Marcus's incident, the use of delivery systems for terrorism and criminal violence had increased, with criminal organizations and extremist groups recognizing that packages could reach targets that were otherwise well protected. The challenge for law enforcement and delivery companies was developing screening procedures that could identify dangerous packages without completely paralyzing the logistics systems that modern society depended on. Marcus served on advisory committees and working groups, contributing his perspective as someone who'd actually faced the threat, who understood both the capabilities and limitations of detection systems. He argued against technological solutions that created false confidence, pointing out that determined attackers would always find ways around screening equipment, that human judgment and instinct remained essential components of security even in an age of advanced scanning technology. But Marcus also pushed back against security theater, the implementation of procedures that appeared effective but actually did little to reduce risk while creating massive inconvenience and expense. He'd seen enough of the security industry to recognize when companies were selling fear rather than solutions, when procedures were designed to protect corporate liability rather than actual human lives. His credibility as someone who'd actually stopped a bombing gave him platform to challenge these approaches without being dismissed as naive or reckless. Through all of this work, Marcus maintained his relationship with Sarah, who had become his anchor in ways he was only beginning to understand. She'd seen him at his worst, in the immediate aftermath of the incident when nightmares kept him awake and every package seemed potentially threatening, when he couldn't walk past a delivery truck without feeling his heart rate spike. She'd been patient through the therapy, supportive through the advocacy work, understanding when his trauma responses flared up in unexpected ways. They married in a small ceremony 6 years after the incident, surrounded by family and close friends, in a venue carefully chosen to have no resemblance to office buildings or loading docks or any of the locations associated with that Tuesday morning. Sarah's vows included a promise to help Marcus carry the weight of his experience, acknowledging that his trauma was part of who he was now, that she was choosing to love him knowing that some things could never be completely healed, only integrated and managed. Marcus's vows to Sarah included gratitude for her patience, her strength, her willingness to build a life with someone who would always carry scars from an experience that happened before they'd met. He promised to continue the work of healing, to not let his trauma define their relationship, to find ways to be present and hopeful even when memories tried to pull him back into that morning of fear and uncertainty and choices made without adequate information. Their marriage was strong, built on honesty about limitations and complications rather than romantic notions of healing love or saving partners from their demons. Sarah understood that Marcus would always have triggers, moments when something would remind him of the package and he'd need space to process the flood of memories. Marcus understood that Sarah had her own traumas from emergency medicine, her own memories of patients lost and injuries that couldn't be healed, her own struggles with feeling responsible for outcomes that were beyond anyone's control. They learned to support each other through these moments, developed rituals and strategies for managing trauma responses, created a home that felt safe even while acknowledging that absolute safety was an illusion, that danger existed in the world and sometimes found even careful people. This acceptance of uncertainty, This ability to build meaningful lives while acknowledging vulnerability, became something Marcus talked about in his advocacy work, a model for how trauma survivors could move forward without pretending to be unchanged. 7 years after the incident, Marcus received news that David Torres had died, not from violence but from a heart attack at age 56. The stress of his work, the years of looking over his shoulder after the bombing attempt, the weight of prosecuting dangerous criminals while knowing he was a target, all of that had taken its toll on his cardiovascular system. Torres had survived the immediate threat Marcus had stopped, but in a sense, the criminals who'd sent that package had succeeded in killing him anyway, just more slowly, through accumulated stress rather than instant explosion. Marcus attended Torres's funeral, sat in the back of the church while Torres's family and colleagues eulogized a man Marcus had met only once but whose life had been inextricably linked to his own. He thought about the strange mathematics of life and death, about how stopping one attempt on Torres's life had bought him 7 additional years, 7 years of teaching and family time and presumably some measure of peace. Was that enough? Had Marcus's action been meaningful if Torres had died anyway, of causes ultimately connected to the stress of being targeted? Sarah, sitting beside him at the funeral, squeezed his hand and reminded him that 7 years mattered, that Torres had lived and loved and taught students and spent time with his family, all because Marcus had made the choice not to deliver that package. The criminals who tried to kill Torres hadn't succeeded in their goal of silencing him before trial, hadn't prevented his prosecution of their organization, hadn't erased his contribution to justice. Marcus had given Torres those 7 years, and what Torres had done with them was valuable and meaningful and worth the fear and uncertainty Marcus had experienced. After the funeral, Torres's daughter approached Marcus, a woman in her late 20s who taught social work at a university in California. She thanked Marcus for saving her father's life, for giving her 7 more years with him, for making it possible for him to walk her down the aisle at her wedding, to meet his grandchildren, to transition from the dangerous work of prosecution to the safer environment of academia. Those 7 years had mattered enormously to Torres's family, had been full of moments that wouldn't have existed if Marcus had delivered that package as instructed. The conversation with Torres's daughter helped Marcus process his complicated feelings about the incident and its long-term implications. He'd spent years thinking about what might have happened if he'd made different choices, about the lives that would have been lost if he'd delivered the package. But he'd spent less time thinking about what actually had happened, the positive outcomes that had resulted from his decision, the fact that David Torres had lived to see his grandchildren and inspire his students and enjoy 7 years of life that the people who sent that bomb had tried to steal from him. This shift in perspective, from focusing on prevented catastrophe to recognizing created opportunity, changed something in how Marcus understood his own story. It wasn't just about stopping a bombing, wasn't just about preventing deaths, wasn't just about recognizing danger and acting appropriately. It was also about creating possibility, about giving people time they wouldn't have otherwise had, about preserving futures that criminals had tried to destroy. Marcus had given David Torres 7 more years of life, and Torres had used those years well, had contributed to the world, had loved his family, had done meaningful work. Understanding this helped Marcus with his own healing process, helped him see his action as something more than just successful threat response. He'd been a delivery driver who'd refused to deliver death, who'd chosen preservation over routine, who'd valued human life more than professional efficiency. And that choice had rippled outward in ways he couldn't have predicted at the time, creating opportunities and possibilities that extended far beyond that single morning. Marcus began incorporating this perspective into his advocacy work and support group facilitation. He talked about the positive outcomes of threat recognition, about the lives saved and futures preserved, about how ordinary people making difficult choices could create profound change. This reframing helped other delivery workers who'd been involved in similar incidents, helped them see their actions or experiences as part of larger narratives about resilience and choice and the importance of individual decisions. 8 years after the incident, Marcus was invited to testify before a congressional committee examining domestic terrorism and the exploitation of commercial delivery systems. He prepared extensive remarks, worked with policy experts to develop recommendations, anticipated hostile questioning from legislators who might want to blame delivery companies for security failures or propose impractical screening requirements that would cripple logistics operations. The hearing room was intimidating, cameras and reporters and senators arranged in elevated seats looking down at the witness table where Marcus sat with several other experts. He'd testified in criminal trials before, but this was different, more public, with implications that extended beyond individual cases to national policy. Marcus delivered his prepared statement, describing his experience with the package bomb, explaining how he'd recognized the threat, detailing the decision-making process that had led him to refuse delivery and safely dispose of the device. Then came the questions, senators probing for details, looking for policy implications, trying to understand how to prevent similar incidents without creating unacceptable economic impacts. Marcus answered carefully, balancing security concerns against practical realities, acknowledging that perfect security was impossible while arguing that reasonable improvements could reduce risk without eliminating the essential efficiency of delivery systems. One senator asked Marcus whether he thought delivery drivers should be armed, should have weapons available to defend themselves or others if they discovered they were carrying dangerous packages. Marcus immediately rejected this idea, explained that adding weapons to the situation would increase danger rather than reduce it, that armed delivery drivers responding to suspected threats could easily make situations worse through misidentification or overreaction. The solution wasn't weaponizing delivery personnel but improving training, enhancing screening, and creating clear protocols that empowered workers to refuse suspicious deliveries without fear of punishment. Another senator asked whether Marcus thought he deserved recognition or compensation for his actions, whether the government should create awards or financial incentives for people who successfully identified and prevented threats. Marcus thought carefully about this question, aware that his answer would influence not just his own situation but potentially create precedents for others. He said recognition was appropriate, that acknowledging people who made difficult choices in threatening situations sent important cultural messages about values and priorities. But he argued against financial incentives, explained that creating monetary rewards for threat recognition could encourage false reports or incentivize security theater that did more harm than good. People should report suspicious packages because it was the right thing to do, because they valued human life, because they were part of communities that looked out for each other, not because they hoped to receive payment. Financial incentives would corrupt that motivation, would turn security into a profit-seeking activity rather than a civic responsibility. His testimony received positive media coverage, was cited in subsequent policy discussions, contributed to legislative proposals that aimed to improve delivery system security while preserving operational efficiency. Marcus didn't know whether any of these proposals would ultimately become law, whether his testimony would have lasting impact beyond the immediate news cycle. But he'd done what he could, had shared his knowledge and perspective, had tried to help policy makers understand the realities of threat recognition from the viewpoint of someone who'd actually lived through it. 9 years after the incident, Marcus and Sarah had their first child, a daughter they named Elena. The pregnancy had been planned carefully, with extensive discussions about whether it was responsible to bring a child into a world where danger existed, where packages could contain bombs, where ordinary people doing ordinary work could suddenly find themselves in life-threatening situations. These discussions had touched on Marcus's trauma, on his hypervigilance and anxiety, on the question of whether he was psychologically ready to be a father given everything he still processed about that morning 9 years earlier. But Sarah had argued, and Marcus had eventually agreed, that refusing to have children because danger existed was letting the terrorists and criminals win, was allowing fear to dictate life choices, was surrendering to anxiety rather than building meaningful futures despite uncertainty. They couldn't guarantee Elena would grow up in a perfectly safe world, but no parent in human history had been able to guarantee that. What they could guarantee was love, attention, support, and the example of parents who'd faced trauma and built good lives anyway. Holding Elena for the first time, Marcus felt emotions that surprised him with their intensity. Love, certainly, the immediate overwhelming love that new parents felt for their vulnerable babies. But also hope, a feeling Marcus hadn't fully experienced since before the incident, hope that the future could be better than the past, that new generations could build on the lessons learned from previous mistakes and traumas. Elena represented possibility in the purest form, a human life not yet defined by choices or experiences, full of potential that hadn't been limited by fear or trauma or the weight of difficult memories. Fatherhood changed Marcus's relationship with his own trauma in unexpected ways. He found himself less willing to dwell on past fears, more focused on present moments and future possibilities. When nightmares disturbed his sleep, Sarah's presence had always helped ground him, but now Elena's needs provided even stronger anchors to the present. 3 in the morning feedings weren't opportunities to replay memories of the package but practical moments requiring attention and care, Elena's cries demanding focus on her immediate needs rather than past dangers. Marcus also found himself thinking differently about risk and safety. As a new father, he felt the instinct to protect Elena from every possible threat, to create perfectly safe environments where nothing could hurt her. But his experience with the package, his years of working in security and threat assessment, had taught him that perfect safety was impossible, that attempting to eliminate all risk actually created different kinds of danger, that children needed to learn to assess and manage risk rather than being sheltered from it entirely. So Marcus and Sarah worked to create balanced approaches to parenting, acknowledging dangers without being paralyzed by them, teaching Elena age-appropriate awareness without burdening her with fear, modeling how to live fully while remaining reasonably cautious. As Elena grew from infant to toddler, Marcus noticed that the skills he developed for managing his own trauma responses proved useful in parenting. The same techniques for staying present and managing anxiety that he'd learned in therapy helped him respond to parenting challenges with patience and perspective. 10 years after the incident, Marcus received an invitation that brought his story full circle. Pacific Express, the delivery company where he'd worked when the incident occurred, was hosting a 10th anniversary commemoration event. The company wanted to honor Marcus for his actions, wanted to use the anniversary to highlight security improvements that had been implemented over the past decade, wanted to bring together the various people whose lives had been touched by that morning. Marcus initially resisted attending, uncomfortable with being celebrated for what had felt like a chaotic series of fear-driven decisions rather than heroic action. But Sarah encouraged him to go, argued that the commemoration wasn't really about celebrating Marcus but about acknowledging how far everyone had come since that morning, about recognizing the systemic changes that had made delivery operations safer, about bringing closure to a chapter that deserved an ending. The event was held at Pacific Express headquarters, in a large conference room filled with people Marcus recognized and many he didn't. Janet was there, the supervisor who'd handed him the package 10 years earlier, now retired but still connected to the company. Several FBI agents who'd worked on the investigation attended, including Special Agent Morrison, who'd become something of a friend over the years. James Sullivan, the Portland driver Marcus had counseled after his traumatic experience, had traveled to Seattle for the event, wanting to show support for Marcus and connect with others who'd been through similar ordeals. Representatives from other delivery companies were present, security professionals who'd studied Marcus's case and implemented training programs based on lessons learned. Corporate executives who'd championed security improvements attended, along with policy makers who'd worked on legislation addressing package-based threats. And in a gesture that moved Marcus more than he'd expected, several members of David Torres's family attended, his daughter whom Marcus had met at the funeral along with Torres's widow and one of his grandchildren. The company president gave a speech acknowledging the 10th anniversary, describing how the incident had catalyzed important changes in company culture and security protocols. Pacific Express had implemented comprehensive training programs teaching delivery personnel to recognize and report suspicious packages, had created clear procedures that protected workers who refused deliveries based on reasonable concerns, had invested in screening technology and security consultations that made the entire delivery network more resilient against exploitation. But the president also acknowledged that technology and procedures could only accomplish so much, that ultimately security depended on individuals making good decisions in uncertain situations, that Marcus's actions represented the kind of judgment and courage that couldn't be programmed or mandated but had to be cultivated through culture and values. Pacific Express had tried to honor Marcus's example by creating an environment where other workers would feel empowered to make similar choices if they found themselves in similar situations. Then Marcus was asked to speak, to share his reflections on the past decade, to offer perspective on what the incident had meant and what lessons remained relevant 10 years later. He stood at the podium, looked out at the assembled people, and felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about him or his experience, it was about all the people who'd been touched by that morning, all the changes that had rippled outward from his decision not to deliver that package, all the ways that one moment had influenced countless other moments over the following decade. Marcus spoke about fear and uncertainty, about making decisions without complete information, about trusting instincts even when they contradicted training and routine. He talked about the psychological burden of having been used as an unwitting tool, about the importance of support systems and mental health resources for workers who face trauma in the course of their ordinary jobs. He acknowledged the people who'd helped him through the aftermath, Sarah and his parents and the therapists and the FBI agents who'd taken time to help him understand what had happened and why. But mostly, Marcus talked about ordinary courage, about the fact that heroism wasn't reserved for special people in extraordinary circumstances but was something anyone might need to access in unexpected moments. He'd been an ordinary delivery driver living an ordinary life when he'd been handed that package, had possessed no special skills or training that prepared him for what he'd faced. What had allowed him to recognize the danger and act appropriately wasn't special abilities but simply willingness to pay attention, to question, to trust his instincts even when they conflicted with instructions. And that capacity, Marcus insisted, existed in everyone in the room, in every delivery driver and postal worker and security professional and ordinary citizen. The challenge wasn't creating superhuman abilities but cultivating awareness, building systems that supported good judgment, developing cultures where people felt empowered to act on reasonable concerns without fear of punishment or ridicule. The real lesson of his experience wasn't that he'd been special but that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when circumstances demanded it. After his speech, there was time for informal conversation, for people to share their own stories and connections to the incident. Marcus spoke with Janet, who told him she still thought about that morning every time she handled special delivery packages, still felt residual guilt for having handed him something dangerous even though she'd had no way of knowing what it contained. Marcus reassured her that she'd done nothing wrong, that she'd followed proper procedures, that the fault lay entirely with the criminals who'd exploited those procedures, not with the workers who'd implemented them in good faith. He talked with James Sullivan about recovery and healing, about how the guilt had evolved over time from acute anguish to something more manageable, about learning to forgive himself for choices that had seemed reasonable at the time even though they'd had terrible consequences. Sullivan was doing better, had returned to work, had found ways to honor the memory of the people who died by advocating for better security measures, by speaking honestly about his experience, by refusing to let the tragedy define his entire identity. Marcus spent time with Torres's family, listening to stories about David's last years, hearing about his teaching and his grandchildren and the peace he'd found after leaving the prosecutor's office. Torres's widow told Marcus something that stayed with him long after the event ended. She said that David had often spoken about Marcus, had expressed gratitude but also a kind of kinship, a sense that they'd both been caught up in something larger than themselves and had both responded as best they could with the information and resources available to them. Torres had apparently struggled with his own guilt about the incident, feeling responsible for having put Marcus in danger by being the kind of prosecutor who attracted violent attention, wondering if he should have been more careful about how he handled sensitive cases, questioning whether his commitment to justice had been worth the risk to others. Marcus was moved by this revelation, by the understanding that Torres had carried his own burden of responsibility, had second-guessed his choices just as Marcus had second-guessed his own. The event concluded with the unveiling of a plaque in the Pacific Express Training Center, commemorating the incident and listing the principles that had emerged from it: vigilance without paranoia, courage without recklessness, protocol that empowered rather than constrained, security that protected without paralyzing. Marcus's name was on the plaque along with quotes from his various speeches about attention and instinct and ordinary courage. He felt uncomfortable with this permanent commemoration, still uncertain that he deserved such recognition, but he understood that the plaque wasn't really about him but about the values it represented. Driving home with Sarah that evening, Elena asleep in her car seat, Marcus reflected on the strange arc his life had taken over the past decade. He'd gone from being a bored delivery driver resigned to monotonous routine to being someone whose name appeared on plaques and whose experience influenced national policy. His life had meaning and purpose now in ways it hadn't before that Tuesday morning. His work helped protect others from similar dangers, his voice carried weight in discussions about security and trauma and the responsibilities of ordinary people facing extraordinary threats. But he'd also lost something in the transformation, lost the comfortable ignorance of someone who didn't fully understand how vulnerable ordinary life was, how quickly routine could transform into crisis, how normal moments could contain hidden dangers. Marcus could never again experience the simple confidence he'd once felt loading packages into his truck, never again assume that following instructions was inherently safe, never again trust that tomorrow would be like today without considering all the ways that assumption might prove false. This knowledge, this awareness of vulnerability and uncertainty, was both burden and gift. It weighed on him, created anxiety and hypervigilance he'd probably carry for life. But it also gave him appreciation for ordinary moments, gratitude for days that unfolded without crisis, love for the people in his life that felt more immediate and precious because he understood how easily it could all be lost. Marcus lived more consciously now, more intentionally, more fully aware that each moment mattered because there was no guarantee of future moments. As Elena grew older, Marcus sometimes wondered what he would tell her about that morning when she was old enough to understand. The story was documented, available online, part of her father's public identity in ways she'd discover as she developed awareness of the world beyond her immediate experience. Would she be proud of what he'd done, or anxious about the dangers he'd faced, or confused about why something that seemed so important to others had been driven by fear and uncertainty rather than clear moral conviction? Marcus decided he would tell her the truth, when the time came, would explain that heroes were usually just ordinary people who found themselves in extraordinary situations and made the best choices they could with incomplete information. He'd tell her about the fear, about the uncertainty, about the luck that had allowed him to hear the ticking and recognize the danger. He'd emphasize that he hadn't been special or particularly brave, just someone who'd paid attention and trusted his instincts and been willing to act despite not being certain he was right. But more importantly, Marcus would tell Elena that she had that same capacity within her, that courage wasn't something rare or magical but something everyone possessed if they were willing to access it. He'd teach her to pay attention, to trust her instincts, to question rather than blindly follow, to value human life and well-being above convenience or protocol. These were lessons Marcus had learned the hard way, lessons he'd paid for with trauma and nightmares and years of processing what had happened and why. If he could give Elena those lessons without requiring her to face similar dangers, then maybe his experience had meaning beyond his own life. 15 years after the incident, Marcus was invited to speak at Elena's elementary school for Career Day. She was 10 years old now, proud and slightly embarrassed to have her father present in front of her classmates. Marcus had done dozens of public speaking engagements over the years, had testified before Congress and spoken at national conferences, but speaking to a room full of fifth graders about his career in security and delivery logistics proved more challenging than addressing policymakers or industry professionals. He kept the story simple, age-appropriate, focusing on the importance of paying attention and asking questions rather than the specific dangers of the package bomb. He talked about his current work helping companies develop better security procedures, about teaching delivery drivers to recognize suspicious packages, about working with law enforcement to prevent dangerous items from entering delivery systems. The students asked questions that revealed their limited understanding of his work but deep curiosity about whether he'd been scared, whether he'd gotten hurt, whether the bad guys had been caught. Marcus answered honestly within appropriate limits, told them yes he'd been very scared, told them he'd been lucky not to get seriously hurt, told them the bad guys had indeed been caught and punished. But he steered the conversation toward broader themes about courage and responsibility, about how everyone would face moments in their lives when they'd have to make difficult decisions without being certain they were right, about the importance of trusting yourself while also being willing to ask for help when you needed it. After the presentation, Elena hugged him and said she was proud to have him as her dad, said her friends thought it was cool that he'd stopped a bomb, said she told everyone he was a hero even though he always said he wasn't. Marcus hugged her back, felt that familiar mixture of love and protectiveness and hope that defined his relationship with his daughter. She didn't yet understand the complexity of what he'd experienced, didn't grasp the lasting impacts of trauma or the weight of having made life-and-death decisions under pressure. But someday she would, and Marcus hoped he was raising her with the tools and perspective to handle those moments with courage and wisdom when they came. 20 years after the incident, Marcus stood again at the drainage canal where he'd thrown the package that Tuesday morning. The area had been fully repaired long ago, no visible trace of the explosion remaining. New construction had transformed the neighborhood, old office buildings renovated or replaced, the industrial loading dock area where everything had happened now surrounded by retail and residential development. The city had grown and changed, moved forward, forgotten the specific details of an event that had once seemed so significant. Marcus was 52 now, gray touching his temples, reading glasses necessary for fine print, his body showing the accumulated effects of age and stress. Elena was a sophomore in college, studying social work, interested in trauma recovery and community resilience, her career path clearly influenced by her father's experience though she developed her own interests and perspectives. Sarah still worked as an ER nurse, still brought home stories of medical crises and human drama, still provided the emotional stability and practical support that made their marriage work. Pacific Express had gone through mergers and restructuring over the 20 years since the incident, the company landscape completely different from when Marcus had been a delivery driver. Many of the people who'd been involved in the immediate aftermath had retired or moved on to other careers. Special Agent Morrison had retired from the FBI several years earlier. Janet had passed away from cancer, her memorial service attended by dozens of delivery drivers she'd supervised over her long career. The criminal organization that had sent the package bomb had been dismantled, its leaders either imprisoned or dead, the specific threat that had targeted David Torres long since neutralized. The world had moved on, as worlds do, processing the incident as history, as a case study, as a cautionary tale taught in training programs and security classes. But for Marcus, standing at the canal on the 20th anniversary of that morning, the experience remained immediate in some ways, still capable of triggering emotional responses, still relevant to how he understood himself and his relationship with the world. 20 years hadn't erased the memory or fully resolved the trauma, had only integrated it more completely into his identity, made it part of who he was rather than something separate that had happened to him. Marcus had prepared remarks for a small commemorative ceremony, invited by the city to speak about the incident and its lasting impacts. But standing there at the canal, he found himself unable to deliver the prepared speech, the carefully crafted words seeming inadequate to capture what the past 20 years had actually been like, how the incident had shaped not just his life but the lives of so many others connected to that morning. Instead, Marcus spoke extemporaneously about time and memory, about how traumatic experiences existed outside normal temporal flow, remaining somehow present even as decades passed, how trauma existed outside normal temporal flow, remaining somehow present even as decades passed, refusing to be fully relegated to history. He talked about the people who'd been affected, not just David Torres who'd lived 7 additional years before dying of stress-related causes, but all the others whose lives had intersected with that package and that morning. He spoke about James Sullivan, the Portland driver who'd unknowingly delivered a bomb that killed 3 people, who'd spent years learning to forgive himself for something that hadn't been his fault. Sullivan had eventually become an advocate himself, working alongside Marcus to support other delivery workers who found themselves in similar situations. Their friendship had become one of the unexpected gifts of Marcus's experience, a connection born from shared trauma and mutual understanding. Marcus talked about Janet, who'd handed him the package that morning with concern but not suspicion, who'd followed procedures she trusted and had lived with questions about whether she could have done something differently. Before her death, Janet had told Marcus that their brief conversation that morning had taught her something essential about the limits of procedure, about how following rules wasn't always the same as doing what was right, about how individual judgment had to remain part of any security system no matter how sophisticated the technology became. He spoke about the delivery drivers who attended his training sessions, who learned from his experience, who carried that knowledge with them on their routes every day. Some of them had gone on to identify and report suspicious packages, preventing potential disasters, validating the investment in training and awareness. Others had completed entire careers without ever facing anything remotely suspicious, but they'd been more attentive, more thoughtful, more aware because of what had happened to Marcus and what it represented about the vulnerabilities in systems everyone relied on. Marcus talked about his family, about Sarah who'd helped him rebuild a life after trauma, about Elena who represented hope and possibility and the future that trauma couldn't be allowed to destroy. He spoke about his parents, who'd passed away in the years since the incident, who'd seen their son transform from a bored delivery driver into someone whose work had meaning and purpose, who'd been proud even though they never fully understood the psychological cost of that transformation. And he talked about David Torres, the federal prosecutor who'd been the intended target, who'd lived to teach students and love his family and contribute to his community because Marcus had heard ticking and acted on that warning. Torres's legacy extended beyond those 7 additional years, through the students he'd taught who went on to become lawyers and judges and advocates themselves, through the grandchildren who carried his values forward, through the cases he prosecuted that had made communities safer even at tremendous personal cost. All of these lives, all of these stories, had been touched by a package that arrived with no sender and no return address, only danger inside. But they'd also been touched by a delivery driver who'd chosen to pay attention, to question, to act despite fear and uncertainty. That choice had rippled outward through time and space, creating effects that Marcus was still discovering 20 years later, influences that extended far beyond anything he could have imagined that Tuesday morning. The small crowd at the commemorative ceremony included some familiar faces and many strangers, people who'd been drawn to the event because they'd read about the incident, because they worked in delivery or security or law enforcement, because they were interested in stories about ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges. Marcus looked at their faces and saw his younger self reflected back, people who thought they understood their lives, who assumed tomorrow would be similar to today, who hadn't yet learned that everything could change in a moment, that ordinary days could contain transformative experiences. He wanted to warn them, to prepare them somehow for the moments when they might face their own packages, their own ticking timers, their own impossible choices. But he also knew that some lessons couldn't be taught, only experienced, that no amount of preparation could fully ready someone for the specific combination of fear and responsibility and urgency that came with genuine crisis. What he could do, what he'd spent 20 years doing, was create conditions that made good outcomes more likely. Better training so people recognized warning signs. Better procedures so workers felt empowered to report concerns. Better support systems so trauma survivors could heal and grow rather than being destroyed by their experiences. Better cultural values that honored attention and judgment and the courage to act on incomplete information. These were modest accomplishments compared to the scope of the problem, compared to the ongoing threats that delivery systems faced, compared to the creativity of people who wanted to use those systems for violence. But modest accomplishments accumulated over time, small improvements that created slightly safer conditions, slightly better outcomes, slightly more people who survived moments they might not have survived without the lessons learned from Marcus's experience. As the ceremony concluded, as people began to disperse, Marcus remained at the canal for a few more minutes, alone with his memories and reflections. 20 years had passed, and in some ways it felt like a lifetime, like the events of that morning had happened to a different person, like the young delivery driver he'd been no longer existed except in memory. But in other ways, it felt like yesterday, like the weight of the package was still in his arms, like the ticking still echoed in his ears, like the moment of throwing it into the canal and running was something that kept happening over and over. This was the reality of trauma, Marcus had learned, this simultaneous distance and proximity, the way something could be both ancient history and immediate present depending on circumstances and triggers and the unpredictable currents of memory. He'd made peace with this reality, had learned to live with the knowledge that some experiences marked you permanently, that healing didn't mean forgetting or being unchanged but rather integrating the experience into your identity in ways that allowed you to function and find meaning. Marcus pulled out his phone, texted Sarah that he'd be home soon, that he loved her, that he was grateful for everything they'd built together. Then he texted Elena, told her he was proud of her, proud of the person she was becoming, grateful that she'd chosen a career path focused on helping others heal from trauma. These relationships, these connections, these were what mattered ultimately, what gave meaning to survival, what made the hard work of recovery worthwhile. He took one last look at the canal, at the place where everything had changed, where a package bomb had exploded harmlessly because someone had paid attention and acted decisively. The concrete showed no scars now, gave no indication of its history. Time had moved forward, healing physical damage even as psychological wounds remained. This seemed appropriate somehow, seemed to capture something essential about trauma and recovery, about how the world moved on while individuals still processed, still healed, still carried memories that shaped who they were and how they understood their place in the world. Marcus walked back to his car, back to his life, back to the work that still needed and make their own choices to act despite fear. The package had arrived 20 years ago with no sender and no return address. But it had delivered something beyond danger, beyond the explosive device it contained. It had delivered a lesson about attention and instinct, about courage and responsibility, about the capacity of ordinary people to do extraordinary things when circumstances demanded it. And that lesson, Marcus believed, was worth all the trauma and fear and difficult years that had followed. He drove away from the canal, away from the commemorative ceremony, away from the past that would always be part of him but didn't have to define his future. The ticking had stopped 20 years ago when the bomb exploded in the drainage canal. But in another sense, it had never stopped, had continued as a metaphor for time running out, for urgency and decision, for the constant pressure to pay attention and act appropriately before it was too late. Marcus lived with that ticking now, heard it in quiet moments, felt it in decisions large and small. It reminded him that time mattered, that choices had consequences, that attention and courage and willingness to trust yourself could mean the difference between catastrophe and survival. This was the gift the package had given him, unwanted and traumatic but ultimately transformative, a permanent reminder that ordinary moments contained extraordinary potential, that every day offered opportunities to choose awareness over routine, action over passivity, courage over fear. 20 years later, Marcus Chen was still making those choices, still hearing the ticking, still carrying the weight of that package and everything it represented. And he would carry it for the rest of his life, not as a burden that crushed him but as a reminder of who he was, what he'd survived, and why every moment mattered. The package had contained danger, yes. But it had also contained possibility, the possibility of discovering strength he hadn't known he possessed, courage he hadn't realized he could access, the capacity to make choices that saved lives including his own. That was the real story of the package, the one that took 20 years to fully understand, the one Marcus was still living every day. No sender, no return address, only danger inside. But also opportunity, transformation, and the enduring truth that ordinary people could face extraordinary challenges and emerge not unscathed but strengthened, not unchanged but more fully themselves, not without scars but with wisdom earned through survival and shared generously with others who faced their own ticking packages, their own impossible choices, their own moments when everything would depend on whether they paid attention, trusted themselves, and found the courage to act. Thank you for listening to tonight's story here on Real Conflict Zone. If Marcus Chen's experience resonated with you, if it made you think about the choices we all face when confronted with uncertainty and danger, I encourage you to share this episode with someone who might need to hear it. And remember, heroism isn't about being fearless. It's about being afraid and acting anyway, about trusting yourself when trust is all you have, about recognizing that ordinary moments can contain extraordinary challenges and that you have within you the capacity to meet those challenges when they arrive. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay aware,